You're a lovely hander-outer. Okay, thank you. Yes, you are. You got more than she did. You might have to share some. And Christine, I got something for you. Oh, where am I? You're welcome. Okay, as we are getting started, we are on Isaiah chapter 2. Yes? Oh, you're still looking for some? Yes, sir. Okay, we get enough to go around? Still coming, still coming. I should have enough. I did 45, so I think I'm counting 41. Now there's 42, but I think we're still doing good. Okay. So as we are getting ready to get started, we are in Isaiah chapter 2, and we're going to try to do a couple of chapters each time we get together. Otherwise, it's going to be next year before we finished Isaiah. I do want to say, for those of you who might miss weeks, just let me know if you would like to do the catch-up, and I can send you the questions and the answers. Some of you would already like to have one with all the answers in it, but that's not going to happen, all right? The other thing that we're going to do is Mike is here tonight, and we've had a request to record these sessions for those who can't be here, and so he's going to start making some CDs available, all right? Hopefully he started recording after we finished singing. Because it's only blessed in here. I'm not sure it would translate well as a recording. Okay, so this week, we started with Isaiah chapter 1 last week. And at the top of your pages there, in Isaiah chapter 1, we learned that the author was Isaiah. There's not a big shock there. But that he had a direct vision, or chazon, or chazon, or however you want to say it in Hebrew. But the fact that it's a direct vision from God says, listen up, pay attention. This isn't just some preacher talking. This is somebody who's gotten a direct word from God. And so when you get it directly from God, you don't need any other kind of authority. It comes with its own authority. And so he's saying, listen up, Israel, you need to pay attention. So we had a direct vision from God regarding Judah. And I did put in parentheses here, remember that the tribes had split into 10, Israel, the northern kingdom, and to 2 tribes in the south, Judah and Benjamin, comprising Judah, or the southern kingdom. So if you'll remember from last week, we talked about after King Solomon, the kingdom divided. The reason we have 12 is because the 12 tribes were the 12 sons or heirs of Jacob. And each one of them kind of had their own territory and their own land. So they divided. The 10 in the north became the northern kingdom, and the 2 in the south, Judah and Benjamin, became Judah, or the southern kingdom. God made his claim that the reason calamity was falling upon Judah. Now remember last week we talked about Judah as being the true Jews. The 10 northern tribes, they have been overtaken by Assyria, and every which way the wind blows, and all kind of people had moved in, and they were intermarrying, and so they were no longer considered the true Jews. Remember we talked last week about Samaria being a part of the northern kingdom, and that's why even from our Sunday sermon we talked about the Good Samaritan, which in their day would have been an oxymoron because you couldn't be a mixed blood and a, good person too. So they're not even counting the 10 northern tribes. This is written to the tribes of Judah, and these were the ones who counted themselves most special in all the world because they were still the true people of God. They were the chosen people. And yet, we find out today that even they are in trouble. God made his claim. The reason the calamity was falling upon Judah was because of their own sin. It's kind of a cause and effect that's happening here. And so he's saying, because you have turned away from me, these things are going to happen to you. In Isaiah chapter 2, all the way through chapter 4, verse 1, we're just going to do one verse in the fourth chapter. God speaks of a twofold vision for Judah. And he speaks first about in the distant future or in the last days. And I'll just go ahead and tell you now because everybody says, when are the last days? The commentator says that Isaiah probably more was of an eschatological mindset rather than apocalyptic. Okay? Is everybody clear on that? Eschatological versus apocalyptic. Eschatological is a big fancy term for the triumph of good over evil. But it was a more distant future, as in one that they would likely see, as opposed to apocalyptic, which is the climax of all times, and the earth is ended, and heaven reigns, and all that kind of stuff. So he's saying that this is more likely a vision for them in the near future and their immediate judgment. All right, so let's take a look at our scripture for this evening, and we'll start with Isaiah chapter 2, and let's just read chapter 2 first so that we don't get too confused. So who's going to be a good reader who will stand up and read loudly and eloquently from an English Bible? Anybody read it in the Hebrew? Okay. All right, I just thought I'd check. We wouldn't understand it, but be okay. Who's going? Oh, we have a volunteer? All right. Well, thank you for doing that. That was a lot to take in. But you can see that he's saying, because you have done these things, this is called cause and effect, because you have turned away from me, because you have turned to the gods, and I'll say a small g, gods, of these other peoples around you. Anybody ever heard that the Jews were not supposed to marry outside of the family? They were not supposed to go out. They were not supposed to intermarry. That's because they were supposed to be of the people of the one true God. And when you started intermarrying, then you started getting in these pagan gods and these deities and all these different idols that they worshiped, and it would pull you away from the one true God. Anybody know what the downfall of Solomon was? Yeah, 300 combines. That's a farmer's joke, people. Come on. Concubines, right? But he was told not to marry outside, and he married somebody outside and, took them all away. All right. Same thing with Samson. He married Delilah. She was outside the family of God. She was outside, brought in all this other stuff, and, bad things happen when you get away from the one true God. All right, so let's take a look at number 1 then. So in chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, Isaiah explains that in the last days, the mountain of Zion, many times you'll find Scripture will use different names for the same thing, okay? So I'll stop periodically and make sure that everybody's caught up and on the same page. So anybody remember the song, Marching to Zion? We're marching to Zion? Right, okay. The city of God. It is literally, they call it a mountain here. It's a pretty big hill, It's a hill, but it's the highest place in Jerusalem. And so the temple was built in Zion, inside of Jerusalem. So if you went over there today, the temple, there's part of it that is still there. But actually, who owns the temple, or the Muslims? That's right. The gold dome of the rock. It's theoretically the rock where Abraham went to slay Isaac. But so I want you to just stay up with the name changes. So whenever you hear Zion, it's actually just repeating Jerusalem, okay? And Jerusalem is inside of Judah, all right? So let's go back to our page here. So the mountain of Zion, the hill in Jerusalem where the temple stood, and will stand out as the most important of all the mountains, not because of its own majesty or prominence, but because it is the mountain of God's temple. So I want you to understand that when it says the mountain of God, it's going to stand in prominence. It's not because you might think it's the tallest of all the mountains or the highest of all the mountains. It's not. It's really a hill. What gives it its significance is it's the special mountain of God. And his temple is going to be there, and his people are going to be there. The Israelites knew they were God's chosen people, and the vision gave them the hope. That's your fill in the blank there, the hope for the future. So, have you ever been speaking to your kids, and you knew you had to tell them something bad, but you told them something good first? So, here's what, if you guys are good, here's what we're going to do in the future. But right now you're in timeout. So we're going to go get ice cream tonight if you guys are good for the rest of the day. But because you've been bad, you're going to have to go to your rooms till the rest of the day. But if you promise not to bug me, tonight there's going to be a reprieve, and you'll get to come out of your rooms, and we'll go and have ice cream for dinner. All right? So that's kind of what he's doing. He's setting them up, and he's giving them this vision of hope of what it's going to be like in the future. That the people would come from all over and submit to the God of Jacob. The 12 tribes were all descendants of Jacob, and therefore the people of Jacob would be lifted up in respect before the world because of their special relationship with God. Judah believed themselves to be the sole heirs of the promise, since Israel, the 10 tribes to the north, had intermarried and no longer were pure. So he's getting ready to tell these people who thought they were pretty special. They thought they were better than everybody else. But he's getting ready to tell them that even you guys have messed up. You have strayed. You have gone away from me. Now, in the future, we're going to get past this. We talked about a word, was it last time? Or I don't know. Remnant. That God has always left a remnant, and that's usually the people who have not bowed down to the other idols and have stayed faithful and true to God. And so he's telling them, you guys are in trouble, you know. As I used to have a friend who'd say, you know, Dad's mad and you're in trouble. So you guys are going to get it. But he's not leaving them without hope. He's saying, you will persevere. You will get through this, and you will still be my chosen people. However, you're going to have to go through a time of endurance and testing and trial because of your disobedience. But they always felt like they had something special because they were the chosen people of God. And so he's saying, you're still going to be lifted up, because eventually people from all over the world will come to Zion. What's happening now? People from all over the world are coming to Zion. I don't think eschatologically or apocalyptically we've gotten there yet. But we're still looking forward to that day when there will be peace, and the plowshare, or the weapons will be beaten into plowshares. meaning there'll be a time of peace. We're not escalating wars and rumors of wars and all these things, but all people will come together and live in peace. So number 2, the vision also promised an eschatological, which means good triumph over evil, hope. People will no longer be at war. They will learn to live and work together in peace as they come together in unity under God. And so unity is your fill in the blank there for number 2. But it's the vision, it's the promise that God is giving to his people. They're going to go through a rough time, but they're going to be able to come back together. They're going to be saved through this, and yet all other people will come and worship God in unity. This is consistent with the promise given to Abram or Abraham, Genesis chapter 22, verse 18. That he would have many descendants, and they would be a blessing to the rest of the world. The people will come to the God of Jacob to learn the ways of love and peace. So if you'll remember back from your history, then it's when God told Abram, just get up and go. Leave your home, leave your family, leave everything that's comfortable, everything that you know behind, and I will make you the father of many nations. And of these people, they will be a light unto the world. So we have to understand that even though he was working through this chosen people, if you've been with us last year, we talked about the Hebrew word possibly comes from the word apiru, which means wanderer. And we think it's interesting that God actually chose the smallest of all clans and the smallest of all nations to work mightily through. If he came in and he worked through the mightiest nations, then you just say, well, the mighty nation won out. That's kind of a duh. Yeah. But when the smallest one does something incredible, then God himself gets the credit. And so as God choosing to work through his chosen people, but it was never a nationalistic pride that it was only salvation for the Israel people. The whole point for them was to be guides and leaders for everybody else, to be the ambassadors of God, saying, here's the way to peace. Here's the way to love. Here's the way to salvation. Here's the way to the one true God. Y'all come on and follow me. Everyone's invited. So that leads us into my favorite passage, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever will believeth in him will never perish, but have everlasting life. And so the whole point for the Hebrew people was to be, remember where it says they're called to be a holy nation? And you say, what does holy mean? Holy means separate. It means set apart. They're not supposed to be like anyone else because they follow the one true God. But the whole point for them was to be a light to the rest of the world so that everyone might see the truth and the love of our Creator God. Amen? All right. So let's go to number 3 then. In chapter 2, verses 6 through 22, God explains through Isaiah that the judgment is coming upon Judah because the people have not relied on God as their light, but have chosen instead to follow the leading of other cultures into idol worship, divination, magic arts, and all of these are an abomination to God. Why? What's the big deal? I've heard some people say that, they walked away from God because the scripture says that God is a jealous God. Well, when you put it in our terms of being jealous of one another or jealous of another spouse or another mate or jealous of somebody's house or car, it seems like a petty thing. But it's not jealousy in that kind of way. It's jealousy in the sense that you have no idea what you're doing. I love when it says that the Philistines, they have everything, and yet they bow down to the work of their own hands. Have you ever thought about that? When they're sculpting idols to worship, who sculpted them? They did. They made the idols, and yet then they turn around and bow down to them. And it's insulting to God. Why? It's insulting that they would worship inanimate objects, the work of their own hands, build a statue, and then bow down to it, or consult inferior spirits. Now, I'm not going to get on to you, but I know there's people who have been to palm readers and card readers and, the tarot and all that kind of stuff. And what's the big deal? I just wanted to get a reading. I wanted to know my future. I wanted to know, what's going on. But let's clearly hear what God had to say about this in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 10 through 13. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire. Most of you probably have not done this, but there were pagan gods who required human sacrifices. So in this day and age, now it's abhorrent to us to even think about that God asked Abraham to sacrifice his own child. This was not a big shock to Abram because there were so many other religions that were doing the same thing. He's saying, okay, in order to be trustworthy of my God, I have to be willing to give him my most precious thing, including my son. Because all the pagan cultures around them, they were already doing human sacrifices. And God stopped him, obviously, and gave him a proper sacrifice. But he was asking him to give up the most precious thing to test his faith and trust in God. So let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire, who practice divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft or casts spells, or who is a medium or a spiritist, or who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord. Because of the same detestable practices, the Lord your God will drive out those nations before you. You must be blameless before the Lord your God. So what is God saying here? He's saying don't bow down to any other false idols. It's a lie. And don't consult the spirits. Don't consult mediums and sorcery and witchcraft and all of these things. I know that some of you might have seen some of these interpreters of the dead, if you will. What was his name for the long time was famous? John somebody? John Edwards. Yeah. I remember it was somebody famous. There was a famous preacher, John Edwards, but that's not the same one. It's one afterwards. But he would somehow read people in the audience, and he would tell them about their dead family members. And you'd see them crying on TV, and sometimes it might even be healing. And because they said, the last thing I did with my mom before she died was fight. And he said, well, you know what, honey, your mom is here today. And she says, it's okay. She forgave you already back then. And so then all the people would go, oh, it's so wonderful. Thank you, John. You have such a gift. You have such a blessing. Now, as I would talk to other pastor friends of mine about this and say, well, it seems like they're doing good things. How can this be a bad thing? And one of them says, because you have no idea who they're talking to. You have no idea. I'll say 90% of this stuff, and I made up that statistic on the spot, but most of it is a bunch of hoo-ha. It's fake. And anytime, I've always wondered why they don't say, I feel like there's somebody named Joan in the room today whose brother died on Tuesday. They don't ever do that. There's somebody in the room whose first name begins with a J. Well, there's 17 people whose names like, oh, yes. And I feel like they have lost their mother. Yes. bunch of it, it's not real, it's not true. But there's two reasons you don't want to mess with it. One, it says, God says, thou shalt not. So you need to hear clearly that God is saying anybody who does this is not his follower. They're not his disciple. They're the disciple of these false teachers. But the even scary thing that goes along with that is there's something called familiar spirits. You see, we're made a little bit lower than the angels. They have awareness and knowledge that we do not. So maybe they know certain things that we do not. And so suddenly there's information that's given to us that you say, oh, there is no way they could have known. No possible way. Well, honey, there is a whole realm of spirits around us. Some of them are good. Some of them are not good. But even if you had a positive reading, you've lost your husband, you've lost your job, you want to know if you're going to survive, whatever, and so you go see one of these readers and they say, you're going to find true love. Oh, and then they meet somebody. Okay, well, maybe it's coincidence, maybe not. But guess what they're going to do next? They have a question. They're going to go again and again and again. And they're consulting somebody who is not holy. They're consulting somebody who is not of God. And they're consulting somebody who will actually lead you away from God. God is saying, don't have anything to do with this. Many of us grew up with Ouija boards and magic 8 balls and, all this kind of stuff. Don't play with it. Don't let your children play with it. If your grandchildren have it, take it and burn it. Get rid of it. You don't want them messing around with any of the evil spirits. And somehow we feel like we live in the enlightened age, and so we're beyond all that spooky stuff. And I'm here to tell you it is real. God thinks it's real. The writers in the Bible thinks it's real. So who are we to say it's a bunch of hoo-ha and it's not real? I've shared with you the story of James Dobson being called to a house because some 11-year-old boys were playing with a Ouija board, and one of them suddenly began picking up the other children and slamming them against the wall, picking them up over his head with a supernatural power that he could not have done on his own. And they actually had to get together and have an exorcism and get that evil spirit out of that boy. You don't want to mess with it. You don't want to seek, even for funsies. Isn't that what Satan says? It's just funsies. Don't worry about it. No big deal. Don't listen to the preacher. That was thousands of years ago. That doesn't still hold true for you. Really? My Bible says that if you strike one letter away from here, it's still true. If it was true for them, it's still true for us. Amen? All right. So, consulting all these things rather than the living God. In Isaiah 2:22, God through Isaiah writes, "Stop trusting in man." In other words, trust me alone. What was the problem? Remember this a couple of weeks ago in church. The problem with Saul. When he was being made king, God was not happy with the people. Does anybody remember why? Why he was not happy with Israel? I think you're right. Who's mumbling that? You are. All right, Nancy. So what was it? Oh, well, yeah, he did bad things like that too. But the whole point that God was actually angry with Israel even for requesting a king. Why? Because God wanted to be their king. Samuel was going to be the mouthpiece for God. He was going to be their shepherd. He was going to be their priest. God would speak like in the days of Moses. God would speak to Moses. Moses would then speak to the people, or Moses would speak to Aaron, and Aaron would speak to the people. But still, there was a natural chain And it was God who led by fire by night and, cloud by the daytime. And they didn't move unless God moved. God wanted to be their leader. And they kept crying out, we can't see God or we will die. So just give us a king we can follow. And so he said, fine, I'll give you a king. And his name is going to be Saul. And so he gave them Saul. But then remember from the lesson from Samuel, Saul usurped Samuel's authority, and when he didn't come, this was our message on patience. When Samuel didn't return in Saul's timing, he said, we have got to go. I doubt he pointed to his watch, but you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, he pointed to his watch and said, we've got to go. The army is dwindling, and we're not going to be able to win this battle if we don't go soon. So bring the offering, and I'll offer it so we can get God's blessings and move on with this. The problem is, he wasn't supposed to offer the sacrifice. It was only the priest, the consecrated priest, that was supposed to offer it. And because of that, Saul lost everything, including, his kingship. And even then, God told him, you're going to get a new king, but this time it's going to be a king after my own heart. And that was King whom? That's right, King David. And King David was perfect, right? No, even then, God bless us, everyone. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, but I do think David had a good heart. And he did love God with all of his heart. He just let his other daydreams get in the way, and he did what he wanted to do instead of doing what God wanted him to do. But the whole point here is that God is frustrated and angry with the people because they are not listening to him. They are not following him. Have you ever gone into a test and you didn't study for it? Or sometimes, I know we got a couple of teachers in the room. Where do y'all get tests from? Okay? Because it didn't come out of the book. I can tell you that. I studied the book, and y'all made up this test from something else, from somewhere else. And suddenly you're looking at this test, and you start looking around the room going, are you writing anything? I don't recognize anything here. And because the people felt lost, they started looking on their neighbors' papers and going, which God are you serving? What are you doing? How? And even God says, the Philistines have everything. They have all the gold. They have all the horses. They have land. They have chariot. They have power. Everything that man could desire. And so the people are like, well, what are you doing? Well, we're worshiping pagan gods. Okay, well, maybe we ought to start worshiping pagan gods. And God says, you missed the point. You missed everything. Because you didn't know which way to go. Instead of consulting me, you went and consulted your neighbors. You are no longer a holy people. You are no longer set apart. You are no longer worthy of being called by my name, my special chosen people, because you have begun going out on your own and trusting in other gods, in other idols, in other religions, and seeking divination. God is saying, stop trusting in man. In other words, trust me alone. And he says, the proud will become lowly, and only God exalted in the end. Both James and Peter quote from Proverbs 3, God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. He repeated it 3 times between the Old and the New Testament. It must be important. So what is it? God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. And the proud are the ones, I like what Pastor Timothy Keller says. When somebody's going through all these questions about different sins and which sins send you to hell and all that kind of stuff, he says, no, it's not the ones that you're picking on. He says there's one thing that sends you to hell: pride. And it's your pride that says, I can do what I want to do whenever I want to do it. And that's actually idolatry. Why? Because you're worshiping at the God of me. I do what I want to do. I am my own man. I am my own woman. Now, how do you think God thinks about that? Like, I'll show you. And in the eschaton, that goes along with eschatological. That's your big word for the day, eschatological. Sometimes you can ask your friends to debate whether or not Jesus had an eschatological mindset. Okay? There's your big word. Okay. But it's the eventual triumph of good over evil. And one day, all the stuff that we have built up, remember the lesson from the Tower of Babylon, right? It was pride. They were saying, God, we don't need you anymore. We're going to build this tower. We're going to come straight up there. You don't have to come to us. We're coming to you. And look at us and look how glorious we are. Anybody seen the Tower of Babylon lately? No. It was scattered, right? It was broken down. And the people were scattered because of their pride. And so at the end of the day, at the end of the times, there's only going to be one standing, and that is God and the people who worship him. And so that's what he's telling them. Don't trust in all these other things. Don't look to other nations. Don't look to their gods. Don't look at their power. Don't look at their might. Don't look at what you think everything else is going right with them. The only thing you need is me and a relationship with me. God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. And then finally, let's turn to chapter 3. And we're going to read all the way through chapter 3 into chapter 4, verse 1. Now, this is one of those occasions where whoever came along and calculated the Bible just really annoys me. Like, why in the world would you make a stop on 4:1? Wouldn't it have been better to make a chapter 3, verse 27? Who decided that was a new chapter? But anyway, we're going to read through 4:1 because it closes the thought before a new thought in verse 2. All right. Do we have anybody who would like to be a reader? So basically, there's a whole lot of bad stuff that's going to be happening to them because of their wickedness, because of their way, because of the way that they have turned away from God. So number 4, in chapter 3, God makes a direct correlation between Judah's sin and their impending peril. Because they have treated God poorly, given into idolatry and divination, their provision and protection are about to be removed. God tells them in advance so that when it happens, they will know it's the Lord's doing. God's not actually doing anything rather than withholding his supernatural care. So that's what supernatural is. You're fill in the blank there. His supernatural care of the protection and provision. On that day, anarchy will rule. They will look everywhere for a leader, but no one will be adequately equipped to lead. You heard that when he said, you'll look to your young children. You'll look to somebody else and kind of slap them on the back and say, okay, guess what? You have the mantle. You lead. And they're going to say, we're in a mess. I don't know how to lead. I don't have any provision. I don't have any wisdom. I don't have any will. I don't have any way. I don't know what we're going to do. And so none will know which way to go to escape their torment. They will reap the bad seeds they have sown. And then I included Galatians chapter 6, verse 7 there. It says where you will reap what you sow. And what they have sown is a disinterest in God and a turning away from God. And so they're getting the fruit of turning away from God. God says, you're going to turn away from me? Then I will turn away from you. And he withdraws his protection and his provision from the people. And, I do think we, have to be careful. And we have to look at this in the way that God is intending it. There is a way of man. There is a way of the world. And in our world, it's money that rules. It's power that rules. And yet, God acts supernaturally in the midst of this in incredible ways. And there have been times throughout history where God has protected Israel, where God has acted supernaturally. Anybody remember when they were crossing over the River Jordan and into the Holy Land? And the first city they came to was what? Jericho. That's right. Don't you remember? Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. And what happened? The walls came a-tumbling down. Could you imagine? I mean, let's put you in that stance. And we're going to cross over the river together. And not only does God supernaturally, divide the river, but then we come to this incredible fortification. And God says, we're going to take this without any guns, any weapons, any swords, any spears. Oh, okay, good. All right, God, what's your plan? March. Okay, we marched. Now what? March again the next day, and the next day, and the next day. Now what are we going to do? Now, when I tell you, blow your horns, and you're like, really? We've been marching for 7 days, and all you're going to tell us is toot our horns? Seriously? And yet what happened when they were faithful? And the walls came tumbling down, and they easily overtook the people of Jericho. Why? Because God acted supernaturally on their behalf. That's how God can and will work. In the New Testament, you'll read many times where it says they tried to lay their hands on Jesus, but because it wasn't time yet, they could not, and he just disappeared. God can act supernaturally to make his perfect will come about. And so what he's telling the people is, I have had this hedge of protection around you. I have given you provision, and yet instead of thanking me, you have turned away from me. And because of that, I'm going to withdraw my protection from you, and everything's going to be laid to waste. And it's kind of like going into timeout. It's kind of like punishing your children. And, how many of you have used the line, this is going to hurt me a lot more than it's going to hurt you? How many of you heard it as a kid? I did. How many of you used it as a parent? I did. Yeah. Why? Because you want your children to do right. You want your children to be good. You don't want to withhold good things from them. But if they're not living right, if they're not acting right, if they're not behaving right, then they don't get blessings. And in fact, they get punished for it. And that's exactly what's happening here, is God is saying, because you have turned away from me, then I will withdraw my protection from you. All right. So I've given you a good historical perspective of what's happening here. Is anybody lost, or does anybody have any questions about what's going on historically, theologically at this time? Okay. How many of you just don't even know what question to ask? Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah.
Thing I can tell you for sure is that we visited Jericho.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
we saw the walls
Mm-hmm.
that were all down
Mm-hmm.
around. There were still parts of the walls down.
Yeah.
And we stayed overnight in this beautiful, big hotel that has a casino.
Mm-hmm.
Where everybody can go.
I hope they don't have any horn players in the casino. It could go bad. Yeah. But yeah. And that's the other thing. For those of you who have not traveled, Jericho is real. This isn't just some made up, fictional story. This is real. It's historical, and you can go to these places today and still see, some of these things. Does anybody remember why they ended up wandering in the desert for 40 years? Right, because they didn't cross the river when he told them to, because They sent spies into the land, and they came back and said, nope, not going to do it. They're too big. They're too powerful. We look like grasshoppers in their eyes. And God was annoyed with them. Said, fine, guess what? You're going to march. And you're going to march in the desert for 40 years until this entire generation passes away because you were not faithful. There was only two that wanted to go in. One was Joshua and Caleb. Everybody else is saying how big it is. Joshua and Caleb came back and said, God's given us a great land. This is incredible. It's the land flowing with milk and honey. Let's go. Let's go tomorrow. And they were looking at human power and saying, it's just too much. We're too tired. We haven't eaten enough. We've been traveling in the desert. It's been hot. We haven't had enough water. And yet what it was they weren't trusting in God. They weren't faithful into following God. And so God said, fine, you can just keep wandering around out here in the desert till all of y'all are gone, until the new generation who's going to be more faithful comes along. But when they crossed over, and they did, and they took Jericho, and they took the land, they were also supposed to do what? Does anybody remember? Get rid of everybody else. Why? Because they were worshiping false gods. And anytime you start thinking for yourself, you're in trouble. And they said, why should we kill all these Canaanites when in fact we can make them do our dirty work? And so they enslaved them so they would do, the dirty work. They feel like that was to the victor goes the spoils, and the spoils are we're going to have these slaves. And yet these slaves introduced false gods into Israel. And Israel forgot about God. They forgot about Jericho. They forgot about the parting of the waters. They forgot about the lessons of being in Egypt. They forgot all that stuff. And so then they started worshiping these false gods. And it's a constant pattern with us ever since in all of history, is we kind of follow God for a little while, but then we start we get off the path, and we start following other things, and we start chasing money, we start chasing power, we start chasing pride, we start chasing things, and all the things that God says is not important. All right. So how does this picture of God fit within your own theological understanding? Does this stretch anybody's picture of God? Sometimes people will try to characterize the God of the Old Testament as the angry God, and the God of the New Testament is the teddy bear, Santa Claus, loving Jesus kind of God. And so sometimes it's hard, but it's exactly why we have to keep going back to the Old Testament. And yet, we see God is going to put them into a time of discipline by taking away their provision. And yet, how could this also be constituted as a loving God? Anybody think about that? Anybody want to respond?
He was doing it for their own good.
Okay.
To me, he was the father figure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The scripture says, the father that loves his children disciplines his children. He only disciplines because he loves them. Some of you had friends who were never disciplined. Why? Because their parents didn't care. Just stay out of my hair. Just go do something else. And the ones who really cared about their children said, no, you're not going to do that. You're not going to smoke that. You're not going to drink that. You're not going to go to that party. You're not getting in that car. No. Why? Because I love you with my whole heart, and this will hurt you. And even you might have to put them in timeout, put them in their room, take away their chores, or God forbid, take away their phone. What? How horrible. Why? Because we love you. And actually, this is a loving act of kindness from God. He could have just wiped them off the face of the earth. It keeps bringing Sodom and Gomorrah back in here. You see that? Like Sodom, like Gomorrah. They were flaunting, their sinfulness. And I don't want you to be that way. I want you to be my people. He could have just rained down sulfur and gotten rid of them. Yeah, Bob? Yeah, you're already ahead of the curve here because you know we're going to get into that with the prophecies about the Messiah. And she's saying is the most precious thing is even despite all the things that were happening. Remember how we started the passage. He was actually giving them a hope and a future. But in the meantime, you guys are going to get it. In the meantime, you guys are in trouble, and this is why you're in trouble, and this is why you're going to go through hard times, but you will survive. And that's showing the grace of God. All right, the last question is, so what does this mean for us today? What influence should this story have on our personal lives today? What does it make us think about? Jan? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was talking. Yeah. I was talking to a guy yesterday, somewhat arguing. But he said that he's a believer, he's in recovery, and so he believes in the unknown God, the greater being, and he tries to do things that please God. He tries not to do things that don't please God. And he's not in church, and he doesn't read the Bible. I was like, so how do you know? How do you know who your God is, and how do you know what is going to be good and what's not good, what's not pleasing to God? And so because we are a people of short-term memories, we have to keep going back and saying, oh, okay, I'm not supposed to beat my children. Oh, that's right. I'm not supposed to commit adultery. I'm supposed to have my eyes for my wife and the wife of my youth and wife alone. Oh, that's right. I'm not supposed to lust. I'm not supposed to go after worldly things. You have to keep coming back because all those things keep coming at us. And even now, as we're going through this series, and we're getting ready to go into a series on Malachi for this entire month. And I begin to, if you're not sure, the whole point of Malachi is God doesn't want half-hearted worship. And sometimes I think about us today and saying, how serious are we about our faith? I believe a lot of Christians treat God as the fire insurance policy, just the get out of hell free card. Let's don't have to do too much. I don't want to be a super Christian. I don't want to have to do all that stuff. You know, I can give a little bit. I don't have to tithe. I don't want to tithe. If I tithe, I won't have enough. And so we begin to worry about all these things that are worldly kind of things, and it turns out to be kind of a half-hearted worship. And everything that I read is consistent in saying how easily we turn away from God and how God is not pleased with our half-hearted worship. Here's his own people, the Jews of Jews, the Judites. They're the ones that are embracing Jerusalem, where the temple is, and the city of Zion, the hill of God, and the promise for the future, and they can't even keep it together because they keep thinking about other things other than God. And so as we close for tonight, I would just encourage us to continue to challenge our own faith. And how serious are we about our faith? And maybe where we might have slipped in our own lives, and we become lackadaisical or lazy, or maybe we need to turn back to the one true God. We need to become serious about our faith because God is serious about us. Amen?